again, we're very fortunate to have our next caller on the phone as well. Jesse Morton, thank you very much, Jesse, for joining us today. You are an ex-Jihadi, and you're the founder of Parallel Networks, which an ex-Jihadi. Can you try and elaborate on that for us? And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
As an ex-Jihadi, I guess I would consider myself an adherent to what we would call Salafi Jihadi ideology. So tracing itself back to the doctrine of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, a 18th century scholar that is sort of the ideological founder of the Saudi state. And then from there, you have divisions and disagreements inside of that school of thought, one of which is the jihadists, which are themselves a mutation that comes from the 1978-79 period, where the Kaaba was held hostage. And from there became a Sahwa movement, which opposed the presence of U.S. forces on the ground and also the westernization of Saudi culture. And then from there became Al-Qaeda and what today is manifested as an even more barbaric ideology of ISIS. So I was once an adherent and a prominent and prolific propagandist for Al-Qaeda then, from 2006 until 2011. About 3 weeks after Osama bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad, I myself was arrested in Casablanca, Morocco, and started to change my jihadist views and perspectives in the context of the Arab Spring, where as a teacher, a professor in Morocco, I had contact with Arab youth, millennial youth particularly, and it fascinated me their more moderate interpretations of Islam and the hope and the aspirations that they had for pro-democracy and liberal tendencies inside of the society. And that really started me on a process towards de-radicalization. And today I work to counter those that hold the ideology that I once espoused.
Was that quite profound in your own sort of feeling? Because you're there, you're choosing to go and fight a foreign war, and then the realization happens, as you've explained, after the Arab Spring. And then when you realize that, yes, we have been talking about it at the end of the show, that the way of jihad is the misconceptions and the way it's changing now, what it is now. So when you sort of began to realize that and change your attitude, what was going through you? What were your emotions at that point?
Well, it's de-radicalization and coming to the conclusion that your interpretation of Islam is a false one is particularly a process, not an event, and it involves a lot of moving variables. So for me, as I suggested, living in the context of the Arab Spring and seeing the hope of a Middle East that I thought I really cared about, what really it was identifying the falsehood that the jihadis promote, which is that jihad in Islam is equivalent to terrorism, that in some way, shape, or form one might consider the attacking of civilians retaliation. And by attacking civilians, you are engaged in jihad. One of my former associates, a man I was pretty close to, Anwar al-Awlaki, was at the time really promoting these perspectives in the English language. And I helped and assisted him in conjunction and coordination with a radical Jamaican cleric by the name of Abdullah Faisal. But being able to move to Morocco and being able to remove myself from intimate contact with associates was a very key component of my being able to step back and analyze things. So I moved to Morocco shortly before Ramadan. And I think that one of the main problems with the Salafi Jihadi ideology is its reliance predominantly on rule following over substance. And when I reflected, once I got into Morocco, on the reasons that I became a Muslim, and when I reflected on what I had become and why I had become it, I started to realize that a lot of the ideology that I adhered to fit personal issues that were in the background. And so the espousal of that ideology was really a result of my own worldview that was a consequence of trauma, a consequence of trouble. And alhamdulillah, I was saved by Allah and granted the honor of being a Muslim. But at the same time, a lot of times converts, they have a saying in the Catholic tradition that there's no greater Catholic than a new Catholic. And I think it's true that sometimes converts can be overzealous. particularly those that come into the religion with a background that's problematic and troublesome.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally made the realization that my espousal of jihadism was largely a consequence of my own personal ailments and pain and suffering, but I wasn't dealing with the internal jihad, which is much more difficult than standing on the street corner or going to wage violence abroad. Dealing with rectifying your own behavior and concentrating on the only real thing that you can truly change in life, which is yourself, sort of allowed me to step back from what I believed in and to realize what the cause of me believing in that was.
Yeah.
And by doing that, I was arrested by the United States government on a street in Casablanca. I was flown home in a private plane. By the time I got on that plane and was put in prison temporarily for my beliefs, I had really come full circle. And I met an imam in a prison in Rabat who was once a Salafi Jihadi imam that had totally changed his perspectives. He talked to me. That generated more emphasis and more encouragement for me to alter my views. And then a long process of reflection unfolded. And it wasn't until I dealt with the realization of what jihad truly means and the real conception of jihad in Islam that I was able to truly go back to the ideology and analyze the fallacies, logical and scriptural, inside the jihadist milieu.
That is very fascinating, and it's really nice to hear that full circle. And it's something that many of our young youth, many of the people who are going through traumatic situations, if they have the support that they get around them to be able to make the correct choices. Mm-hmm. And I know you talked about that you were so far gone off the, not necessarily off the rails, but you were in a state of mind that was not right. But you've come away from that, and you talk about the differences. So through my experience and people I know, some of the people who were so far away but then made the choices, you're right, they do become sometimes even better, and because they're able to reflect between the two. So just got one more quick question, because it is really fascinating with what you're saying about. Do you think government and foreign policy and the discrimination against minorities at home play a role in radicalization? Was that something in your mind? Because I think you've touched on it, but I don't think it was actually that. There were some other traumas going on.
Yes. Well, I think that, the foreign policy grievance fits for someone who wants to have a cause and a feeling of significance. The problem with the foreign policy grievance is that a lot of times it doesn't add nuance to the subject. And so for me, I saw myself as an activist and an advocate for Muslims all over the globe. But I never really made the connection, as simplistic as it is, that violence only makes matters worse. Yeah. And this is the case that you have when you talk about governments. You could talk for a long time, and I know in your program you deal primarily with the Ahmadi community in Pakistan. If you were to look at the governmental actions across the Muslim world with regard to the way that some of them oppress and repress minorities, what the consequence of that is it makes a more polarized society. And it gives this feeling to the jihadist, the fundamentalist even, the one that doesn't necessarily even believe that violence is the answer, that the other, the one that they disagree with, that there is some righteousness with regard to cleansing the society or purifying the society. And a lot of times that involves things that belong to the fundamentalist worldview, things such as takfir, declaring a Muslim a non-Muslim. And as the Prophet ﷺ said, the one who makes the accusation of takfir, if it's not true, it returns back upon them.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that this is a divine principle that does exist if one is able to look at what happens as a consequence. So you're looking at external factors. The government is perceived to be oppressive. The West is engaged in a war against Islam. And then the minority becomes something where it's close to you, so you can address that. Your hatred and your anger can be displayed against real people. But at the same time, they all come together to formulate a justification that is essentially irrational, but you convince yourself in your head that you're waging jihad or that you're struggling in the way of purifying an Islamic society and making everyone believe as you believe, contrary to the primary principle of Quran, la ikrah fi din, that there's no compulsion in religion. And so you don't realize it, but you're actually nullifying and rejecting one of the cornerstones of the Islamic faith and tradition. And so you unwittingly become an ally of Shaitan, if you will.
Yeah.
And you can think at the same time that you're the most righteous and the best and the only right and correct position. The problem with regard to governmental persecution is rather than making things better, it actually makes things worse.
Right.
In the same way that the problem with Salafi jihadism, particularly recently as manifested by ISIS, is this doctrine that everyone who doesn't agree with us is in fact a non-Muslim at all, leads into the slippery slope of ultimately waging violence against minorities.
Exactly
and
right.
The consequences do prevent communities from going forward and from fighting a war. I think we're living in an age of extremisms in the plural, and we are living in an age of polarization where what we have is we have two camps of people in a lot of nations and in a lot of societies, and by making things so black and white, so right and wrong, all that happens is they go and intersect against each other, and it creates more volatility and more violence.
Jesse, I mean, I think we could probably listen and talk to you for a lot longer, but time is always against us, especially when we're nearing the end of the show. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming on and being so honest and sharing with us your feelings and your emotion. And both of us and our viewers, we wish you all the best on your journey, that you're taking. And I hope you continue and gets you closer and closer to our Creator. And, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
I appreciate it. My pleasure to be here. Thank you much.
No, thank you very much. Again, we're nearing the end of the show, and I haven't given the results to
you can
to
go
Twitter. So if you just allow me,
I'll
I'll just quickly do that now. So the question that we did ask, what was the meaning of Khatam Nabood? And 90% of all those people who took part in this Twitter feed said it's the seal of the Prophet. So I think we sort of educated enough people.
I don't know, they were already educated, but some might have benefited out of it. I'm sure those who are listening to us. So on this Drive Time show, I think we had a good chat about some important topics, Khatm Nubuwwat and Jihad. And I hope you enjoy your evening. And we say goodbye here for today. And and we'll be on to the news.